Hello and welcome to week 6 of group and organisational communication. This week I have called Organising, and we're going to be looking at systems theory and cultural approaches to considering organisation and organising. And for the first time we're really going to start talking about organisation theory proper, because what we've been doing up to this point is talking about the theories that relate to structure, the theories that relate to people and processes, and some of the big theories around rules and regulations and resources, and also thinking within organisations. So very obviously people processes, but people processes that are about individuals and the way they operate. Now we're going to be looking at organising itself, which is another strand to what we need to focus on. This, you may well be pleased to hear, is our last big week of theory in talking about organisation, and from next week we're going to be covering theory, but we're going to be looking at application. And I feel for many people this may be a section of the course, the next 6 weeks, which is really quite familiar in some ways, and may well generate a certain kind of easier discussion because the concepts are perhaps more familiar to us. But also the next 6 weeks is going to be based on the strategic communication, or getting you towards the strategic communication assignment, which is a big piece of the coursework and our final pieces of coursework once the essay has been submitted. And it will get you into the habit and process of looking at organisation and working within it to actually use communication in a particular way to a particular effect, and we're going to talk a lot more about that later. So I'd like to make a couple of points with this slide about organisation and then organising, because up till now I have spoken about it, and I feel, seem to be troubling over, defining what exactly it is we're talking about. So the first thing is to say that the history of organising is located in this idea of organisation theory. And when we look at what we're talking about in terms of what defines an organisation, in terms of its historical place, we had the classical theories, and those were sometimes referred to as administrative theories or traditional theories, and they really dealt with the processes of infrastructure and the processes of manufacturing, as you will recall, through structures and through the role of people in particular ways. However, this writer, an administrative theorist, Dwight Waldo, in the 1960s spoke about organisation theory, an elephantine problem, in a particular paper, a 1961 paper in fact. And what he was referring to was this idea that the process of organising was and is created by people. It's not localised to the hard structures as an organisation is. So when we have been talking about organisation, some of the time we've been talking about the actual material site, and we've also referred to the people, but nonetheless the people within it are still occupying certain specific roles. And through the theories that we've looked at so far, classical theory, human relations theory, we've really been focused on the ideas of roles that individuals have. However, when talking about organising, we are now starting to focus on this idea of function and relationship with the environment. So through this lecture we're going to be leaning on the work of Barbara Czarniawska, who has written about Karl Weick, and Karl Weick is the theorist who I've mentioned at some point in a previous lecture, and we're now going to focus on his work, which really emerged in the 50s and 60s in terms of its prominence, in that he introduced systems theory to the concepts of organising. And we're going to get to that in some detail, but let me just talk a little bit about this picture here, this idea of conditioning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Now, the reason I've put this on the slide is because the actual shift from looking at predetermined behaviours to stimulated behaviours by the environment emerged in social sciences, and there was this concept within behaviourism where a stimulation could actually produce a certain kind of response. Therefore, behaviours are not innate, but are rather conditioned. And on the left you see this example of a whistle and the dog thinking of food, and that's the kind of Pavlovian experiments that you would have heard about in terms of dogs being conditioned to respond to something. And then a particular other kind of conditioning that behaviorism looked at, where there was no specific association, but there was a particular kind of behavior that could be enacted and then a response. So just to finalize, Barbara Czarniawska talks about administrative theory being the way things work, and organisation theory is not about action but about function, and therefore it is constructed out there in some way, because the organising actually is dependent on the environment and it changes. So as you'll be familiar from previous lectures, the work on organisation and thinking about organising, certainly in the Catherine Miller text, reveals the successful application of metaphor for considering the way organisation actually works and comes about and operates. So today we're going to look at a metaphor for systems theory and look at how that applies to organising. And just for completeness, I'm including the fact that I want us to consider the cultural metaphor and its relevance in organising. However, I'm not going to spend time on the cultural metaphor. I'm instead going to refer you to the relevant chapter in the Catherine Miller text, because she actually covers both of these things in a single chapter. What I want to do differently in this lecture from what she does in the text is spend more time on Karl Weick, who, as I said, we're going to look at through the work of Barbara Czarniawska. And the reason we're using her is because she is a contemporary theorist who has actually applied Karl Weick's theories to looking at organisation. So just to go back a step, we know that the classical management theories and scientific management theories had this overarching machine metaphor, and they became unsatisfying to subsequent researchers who were looking at the kind of human elements within organisations, and found that, as we said from our subsequent lecture, they did work, the human relations and human resources theorists, as they became known, started to look at the human element within organisation and the fact that in interview, individuals, employees, were talking more about their relationships with the managers and colleagues, and aspects of, I suppose, human psychology around work that were impacting the way they thought about organisation, the way organisation happened. Secondly, as I said in this lecture, because we're starting to look at the foundations of organising, we need to understand where it came from. And organising comes from obviously thinking about organisation, but organisation theory became a way of looking at organisations from the 1930s to current day. We can now start talking about organisation theory, and it contains things like classical theory and human relations theory, because organisation theory rather started to look at the way organisation and organising came into being, and is separate and apart from some of the structural processes and human processes that we've looked at when looking at the other theorists. So what Miller says is that in the latter part of the 20th century, from the 1950s onwards, systems theory as applied to organisation gained ascendancy. And what is systems theory? Because we haven't said what it is yet. Systems theory considers organisations to be like biological organisms in our application here. So it is the relationship with the environment and the individuals within an organisation as interdependent. Cultural theory, as I said, we're not spending time on it in this lecture, but cultural theory takes an anthropological approach of organisation as sites of interlinked values and behaviours and artefacts. So the image on the left with the butterfly, and obviously the location of the butterfly on a flower and probably in a meadow, is really reference to the systems metaphor. The father and baby in the pool is reference to the cultural metaphor. The fact that in the baby father situation, we have, individuals who are in effect growing together, maturing together, and have these interlinked values, i.e. one teaches the other, and both teach each other rather, and that those behaviours and responses are interlinked. The systems theory on the left looks at the butterfly in the environment and the fact that the butterfly is in fact impacted by the environment and changed by the environment, and also changes the environment by being part of it. So we're now going to start looking at general systems theory, or systems theory for short, but notice the abbreviation GST, which is obviously going to be different from structuration theory, which is just ST. So when you're talking about systems theory, you probably want to use the full abbreviation. We're now going to be talking about this particular theory, which is actually a theory from biology, and it was founded by Karl Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who's an Austrian theoretical biologist. He was born in 1901, and this theory emerged in the 60s. He's one of the key founders of general systems theory, and organisation theory was applied to understanding organisation as being like biological systems. So what we're saying for the purposes of our lecture is that these theories and these ideas of the system were marshalled by the likes of Karl Weick, who was an organisational theorist, to understand how organisation and organisational communication actually operate. So here is the first of our overview slides. It's, I guess, quite simple in the sense that it says systems are made up and obviously consist of what are called components. They work in a certain way, which we are calling processes, and then there's an output or properties. So just notice that properties is the output. Now there are some common components that are present in a system that is biological, according to general systems theory, and it is these three components, the idea that there's an ordering, and I've given you some organisational examples. So in a hospital, for example, there are specific departments and they have greater and lesser authority or specific authority according to what it is that they're doing within the overarching process that is the organising of the organisation. Then there's a connectivity between the different departments. So when you first go into a hospital, you go through triage, which is this process by which an individual's condition is considered in terms of how desperately it needs to be treated and who needs to treat it, so how quickly. And then of course there are all these different departments, labs, you go through screenings like X-ray and such like. There's the relationship between these different departments. If one isn't working, then often the rest can't work. They're all, you know, completely connected. If you go into a hospital and you don't have some kind of screening, then you know, and we do work in hospitals sometimes that don't have these things, then, you know, someone has to make an assessment as to what's going on without lab results and without knowing from the specific test, which is meant to improve the reliability of a particular observation. But really important to general systems theory is this idea of permeability, the idea that information as a flow actually happens within a system and outside of a system. So in terms of our organisation and thinking about it, we understand that the external environment may be something like media, or if it's a hospital, other hospitals, for example. All of those have an impact on the way the hospital operates. It's not separate. Its operation as an organisation isn't separate from these things. And that is one of the key new things, I guess, systems theory gives us as a way of looking at the way organisation operates. Okay, so let's take our first look at Karl Weick himself. He was at the University of Washington. He's still alive. He still has his email address on their website, so if you choose to email him, you could do. The reason I've put him here is because he's obviously influential to this idea of organising, and in fact it is him who is attributed to having introduced systems metaphor in the 1950s to organisation theory, because he's an organisation theorist. So let me just read this quote from Zaniorska and we'll unpack it a bit. She says, if organisation theory itself was shaped so as to fit systems theory 50 years ago, at present it is systems theory that is adapted and selectively used by organisation theoreticians. So two things, don't worry about the date, it does apply to the right time. This was a paper from 2005. Secondly, let's look at what she's saying. It's not a criticism of Weick. What she's saying is, if organisation theory had to accommodate systems theory 50 years ago when it was first introduced, we are now so proficient in considering organisations as being like biological organisms, or at least we can use that metaphor to apply some of the ideas to organising itself, that it is the systems theory that is being interrogated in terms of its application. So something that was said by another academic, Richard Lewontin, in 1995, is that when Darwin applied terms like organism, environment and adaptation to biology, he was actually going through this process of mechanising it in a sense, in that he was talking about specific components and their reaction to each other. Now, in the 2000s, according to Barbara, and she talks about that as, you know, the present moment, because that's when she was writing, she says that the metaphors of biological organism are actually not working so well as applied to organisation theory for a number of reasons, which is why we're using Zaniorska's analysis, if you like, of Karl Weick, her application of Karl Weick to interrogate the systems metaphor. So the first thing she says that's important is that the environment is not a pre-existing set of problems to which an organism, or an organisation in our case, must find solutions. Because in fact, as you know from, or as you may know from a study of biology, the organisms themselves are created in part because of the external environment. And in the same way, we can think about organisations being created because of the external environment, not only to serve a particular need, so not only in terms of kind of market forces and that kind of thing, but also it is constructed by people who exist in that moment with a current thinking. And only those, essentially, if you think about it, only those employees who kind of fit the requirements of the time can be accommodated. Others who are on the periphery of those ideas, or whose ideas exist on the periphery, rather, whose ideas extend the boundaries, might not fit. And so you get these kind of people who I guess are coined mavericks or eccentrics, or who are considered beyond their time, because as employees they really don't fit the environment. But if they have enough of the right conditions around them, they will be the ones who would potentially be creating the organisations of the future. So the other thing that she says is the environment of organisms consists to a great extent because of other organisms. So that is to say that a company, an organisation, exists within a series of other companies. It can't exist on its own, and that is true of biological organisms as well. The environment is created in which there is I suppose, multiplication, which we're going to come to, and there is a relationship between organisations. They work together, similar organisations, because they create a whole network, and they couldn't exist otherwise. As I referenced in a previous lecture, when talking about schools and the education environment, without other schools, one school isn't going to be able to survive too long, because it almost needs the, what would be the best word for it? It needs the support and collusion or justification by the presence of other organisations, other schools, in order to make this a worthwhile enterprise. If there is nothing that supports the notion of a school, then, you know, if there's no purpose at the end of it, no qualifications, no basis on which to consider the qualifications, then everything kind of collapses. The other point she makes is that the environment of organisations consists to an even greater extent of other organisations. Sorry, I made that point already. By the same token, the notion of adaptation is misleading when applied to indicate a one-way relationship between an organism and its environment. So I think we've said that about organisation already as well, that the environment creates the organisation as well as adapting to it. Further, while it can be claimed that organisms have boundaries separating them from environments, it's much more difficult to apply the notion of a pre-existing boundary to organisations. And that's because we have things like mergers, acquisitions, transnational interactions, networks, and so they make the idea of a pre-existing boundary highly tenuous. So new concepts and metaphors are constantly being sought. And as I said, Karl Weick is at the University of Michigan. He's described as having introduced some really important concepts with respect to organisation, loose coupling. He's worked on mindfulness, and in particular, this notion of sense making, which we have kind of touched on when looking at decision making, but it goes much further, and that's something for us to keep our eyes out for. Here's our second slide of general systems theory information. So we have this idea of processes, which in the language of general systems theory is about input, throughput, and output, what comes out. And we understand this idea of information going through a system, but this actually, in the general systems theory concept of it, refers to information that is transformed in some way. So I've given you this example here of patient records, or a patient who comes in. There are medical records that are technical and created for staff in the language of the clinical environment, and potentially they're meaningless to patients, which is why when medical information is given to patients, it's reworded, reframed, and obviously the desire for all parties is that the information is clearly understood and is meaningful. Therefore, patients can make decisions based on the information they're given. So this is conceptually what I'm going for, the fact that information is reworded, and what comes out may well be partial information. So then we have this idea of feedback, and this is a well-known process for us, but in the language of general systems theory, meaning for us applying it to organisation, we have an idea of it being a function of throughput. So when it goes into the environment, it is either corrective or it is about growth. So we talk about negative feedback and positive feedback, and we understand that quite instinctively. A corrective is about a critique of a particular situation, asking for something to change. A positive is everything's going well and therefore keep doing what you're doing, or maybe this is a way to improve it. And so it's not a negative, but it's a way this could be better. So in the language of organisation and organising, we can talk about deviation reduction, which is about the customer ratings that are negative, for example, and a growth situation, which is deviation amplification. So those particular terminological changes mean that we're starting from a particular standpoint and we want to reduce a place from that standpoint. So that would be something that's negative, or we want to amplify from that particular standard and therefore seek growth. So we're just talking about different language for a similar concept or the same concept, but the reason the language is different is because it is, as a process, slightly different, and so we need to be mindful of that. With respect to Karl Weick and his seminal works on organising, he wrote this book called The Social Psychology of Organising, and he, I guess, repurposed a title or changed the title from The Social Psychology of Organisation, which was written by somebody else. And in this way, he was signalling this concept of organising being iterative, which I've mentioned before, meaning it's an ongoing process. So here are two quotes that come from his book. One is, "Open systems became the mainstay of organisational analysis." Now, an open system is one in which there is a regular exchange with the external environment, so regular feedback, in other words. And, this was widely accepted and is widely accepted, but he considered this to be underdeveloped. So it was Weick who took on board the idea of looking at what general systems theory had to offer as a way of explanation with respect to the process of self-regulation within organisations. So he then added this quote: "While organisations as systems depending on an energy input are obviously best treated as open systems, as information systems they are best described as autopoietic." Now that word autopoietic is simply a fancy word for reproduction, and autopoietic means self-reproduction. So we have this idea of something that's self-defining and constantly reaffirming. So let's take, for example, this idea of Instagram. And Instagram takes information, you post it, and there are a series of possible actions. You can like a post, you can share it, and the platform has created within its boundaries a number of possibilities. Now, this idea of self-regulation and self-reproducing for me is very clear in what Instagram has done, because information is only shared with Instagram or Instagram companies. I think they just made a change recently, certainly syncing the way you can chat across different platforms, but they're essentially owned, when they're owned by the same company, they have started to do this. So the information basically keeps building the same edifice. It stays within Instagram. You will correct me if this is a terrible example. You can correct me in tutorial. But what I'm saying is the idea is it continues to build Instagram. It's not, if somebody accesses it, for example, from another program, obviously it takes them to Instagram, and often it does things like saying, you know, to view this information, you'll need an Instagram account. In other words, it continues to build this same environment. And so there was this distinction made with self-reproduction, if you like, as in terms of using this term from biology. This is our last slide about general systems theory, and we can look at this in terms of how it relates to organisation. So there are these particular properties or particular concepts, if you like, that we can talk about that happen in nature, and they can be considered in terms of how within organisation they are also a truism. So we have this idea of holism, which promotes the idea of putting people together to brainstorm, for example. So with the right conditions, it's going to be better than letting them work individually. So it's the idea that the whole, as in everyone working together, is going to be a better process. And if you think about it, when you're working on group assignments, I would like to think that there is at least some feedback and exchange, and the hope is that in that exchange and feedback you get better ideas, or at least you get ideas that have a certain kind of agreement, and within the definition of what it is that you're doing as a group, one hopes that there is this improvement. I think of ideas. I think across a much bigger sample, you actually get a coalescing of ideas. You certainly get an agreement around certain kinds of thoughts or ideas. Basically, certain things gain traction, and I suppose this is how politics works. You know, you in a two-party system, you end up having to vote for X or Y, and as a result of that, you know, you've made a choice under the umbrellas of X and Y, and that gives you more stability than if you have X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, etc. And all of those parties end up having to be party to the decisions that are made or the policies that are made. So it's just a concept that we need to be mindful of. The system is more than a sum of its parts. It's actually combined of, or it actually generates a process in which the output is going to be better than the individual possibilities. The next one is equifinality, the idea that many routes lead to the same destinations. And in this way, we can think about systems being integrated. So within a company, the idea is everyone essentially is working towards a common goal. So a company or an organisation can have many different moving parts, but ultimately the goal is the same. So a hospital, for example, I keep using hospitals, but that kind of environment, the goal is health, the goal is wellness. There are different routes to it, of course, but they all are supposed to lead to the same place. So entropy, opposed to negative entropy, let's talk about entropy, is the tendency of a closed system to run down. So if you take away from a biological system water and light, this system eventually will end. Negative entropy is a result of information flowing. It's one part that allows for adaptation, diversification in business, rebranding, etc., because of the information flow. So negative entropy is a result of information flowing. It's the fact that the system isn't closed and of its resources and therefore will run down. This idea of requisite variety really talks about internal diversity, which allows a responsiveness to the environment. So in a biological environment, you can think of meadows. They have different plants. They all work in different ways. They attract different kinds of insects and survive better under different kind of conditions. But the meadow always survives and always works. The problem is when you have a monoculture and a particular environmental situation actually destroys the organism or destroys the biological entity, and therefore it would kill it out. And there's no way for something else to work in its place in order to sustain the environment for it to come back. It's completely decimated. And you see this in environments biologically, where a particular bug kind of wipes everything out, and it's no longer plausible, no longer possible. So the variety, as we're saying, in an organisational sense, is this one where anything internal that is diverse is going to allow for lots of possibilities. And I think we can all think of very everyday examples where that is the case. Having gotten to this place where we've explored general systems theory in terms of its theoretical orientation and some of its language, we can now start to apply it to organisational communication and see where it makes a difference. Because metaphor and theory is all about giving us ways of looking at things. It's about giving us this lens through which we can see things. So we've already gotten ourselves through classical theory, for example, in which there is the hierarchical organogram and the communication is through the Scala chain, this idea of vertical communication, even with Fayol's bridge, which allows for horizontal communication. We understand through classical theory and classical organisations that the communication is up this chain in order to get kind of management alerted and information to pass from one process, if you like, within an organisation to another. Then we looked at human relations and human resources approaches, and we know from that that there was this family metaphor for the way individuals relate to each other and connect. It's less formal, and we can understand from those approaches things like team building and employee satisfaction. Now, when we look at systems theory, we can actually look at something like a communication network, and we know from our current lexicon related to organisation that this would be a component. This is part of a structure, and it's the way the organisation can be built up. So we can start to think about the properties of a network, of a communication network within an organisation, using this new lens through which to view organisation. We can think about content in terms of information that flows through an organisation, and we can think about it in terms of influence. So say, for example, we have an organisation that is a political party. The information that flows through it, that content, has an impact on all manner of other organisations, on lobby groups, on resistance groups, on advocacy groups, and because a result of the policy making that comes out of a party, it affects gendered groups, groups that striate society in different ways. and maybe we can think about all the different fragments, if you like, the different components of society that are impacted through the information that comes out of a political party. Then we have things like the network mode. What are the approaches that happen? The technologies, is it face-to-face communication, and how does that have an impact? We can also talk about network density. Are the connections close or are they loose interconnections? Now on the slide I've put two particular points of interest for individuals. You could take a positional point of view. Where are you in the network? What is your position? How does that impact when you receive information and the kind of information you receive? We can take a relational perspective. What is the relationship, the communication relationship that emerges through the activity of the organisational system? But we also have other points to make about networks, for example. We can talk about their strength, the connection between nodes, people who are particularly good communicators or have a good relationship. We could talk about symmetry. Do those individuals have the same power, or is there a particular power dynamic? We can talk about the multiplexity, the number of different kinds of content through a particular link. I think just from this one kind of expansion of idea alone, you can think about all manner of connections and the ways in which networks become important as communication systems. And we're going to move on and look at an example just now. But first, let's look at a little bit more about organisational communication. So let's examine here a quote from Zaniorska and consider the ways in which he thinks Karl Weick made a contribution to organisational theory. So Karl Weick, as we know, prioritised this idea of organising, and really what we're saying is he is mostly associated with the concept of organising being iterative, or at least he proposed the lens, let's say, and therefore became associated with this idea of organising. Organising is thus an ongoing encounter with ambiguity, ambivalence and equivocality, being part of a larger attempt to make sense of life and the world. So what Zaniorska says is that Weick's theorising, apart from the organisational field around him, apart from his work within that, he also came up with this idea of relating what goes on within an organisation to being similar to a biological system. And in particular, there were issues like uncertainty, which in a regular organisation is considered as a negative state, something to be eradicated and corrected, whereas Weick actually cherished the idea of ambiguity, she says, and gave it a central place in the evolutionary process. So whereas through the traditional view of an organisation, or through the theories of other organisational theorists, we would be seeing ambiguity as a problem, Weick considered it as part of an ongoing process that never completely succeeds. And what we're going to do is look at an example of an organisation. I'm going to talk you through it, and we will consider the ways in which the questions are different, slightly different, and of course generate therefore different answers, because we're looking at organising in a different way. So let's look at this organisational environment. Let's say you were interested in starting up a hairdressing business, and we're going to be looking at the organisation through this general systems theory approach of considering the organisation. So the term for the concerns that you're dealing with is enactment. And let's say we're concerned about the information environment. So this is our concern when creating this business. There are a number of things that we are going to have to think about. The staff we have, what aptitude they have, the customers that we want to reach out to, what kind of services we want to provide, and I guess we're going to have to think about staff retention as well. What are their aspirations once they come into the business? Are they going to stay or are they going to leave? So one of the things that Weick says is there's not some kind of monolithic singular environment that exists detached from the people who are in the organisation. Of course, what causes them to move on, what causes them to remain comfortable in the company, is more than what goes on within the organisation itself, but also the environment. So at this level of semantics, if you like, the level of meaning, what might you call your member of staff? Are they going to be a stylist, a barber, a colourist? Obviously these are, different roles, slightly different roles. A barber and a stylist, you could argue are the same thing, but maybe they, with the association of those words, they actually approach the, certainly they're considered differently, but they approach their craft differently as well. Do you give them levels as they go up within the organisation? Are they 1, 2, 3, or are they senior, junior, senior, advanced? Do they deal with general hairdressing, or do they have specific kind of types of expertise with maybe, wedding hair, or, some kind of hair dressing for a particular function? Separately, what does your environment look like, and how do you talk about that when you advertise it? How much does that have on your business success? How much does the talking about it, the information, actually make a difference? So essentially we're singling out two areas for our consideration in terms of the information: the staffing and the environment, and we're looking at skills and branding. What skills they have, as I said, and how do we market these? So maybe if we're considering attending to more male or female clients, you would feel that you need to have stylists of different sexes. You may feel that you want to change what they're described as in order to make that difference. How many female barbers do you see, for example? Or is it that female hairdressers typically gain a different title? I've seen female barbers, of course. I've seen them called barbers and work on men's grooming and work on beard trims, for example. But you don't see that a lot. And why not? Because the skill is there, the aptitude is there. So is it about branding? Is it about labeling? Separately, when you're actually looking for individuals, you're going to hire people. What do you actually look for to actually choose that person? Is it going to be a CV? Is it going to be a personal recommendation? You have certain kinds of criteria then for considering people, and this would depend on how much you can afford, what kind of operation you're looking to create, and also you're going to want to be responsive to your environment. So we have the information environment that we're enacting by describing people and defining them in certain ways, and of course that relates to a real environment, and within that real environment of running a business, you're going to have everything from solutions to problems, and this is a separate process, if you like, and it's called selection, and we're going to look at this process. So here's a selection process, this idea of an environment that actually offers all of these services. And we can talk about the adaptability of an environment through this concept of equivocality, which is the inherent unpredictability, if you like, of the environment. So we have different kind of services being provided, hairdressing services, you know, fades, adding extensions, washing and beard trims. Now, reducing equivocality or making sense is a central process of organising. So we have equivocality on one end of a scale and predictability on another. And in an environment where you have a lot of kind of potential for crisis, you would talk about high degrees of equivocality. So let's say in this hairdressing environment, you realise that your particular market is not what you expected. It's not 50% and 50%, 50% men and 50% women, but you realise you need to cater to different age groups, and you probably need different hair skills. So in the process of expansion, you realise you need to take on a new member of staff. Now let's look at the ways in which you might consider this through the process of looking at it through systems theory. Now you've taken on this new member of staff and they've come into this environment, and what they're having to do is make sense of it. So Karl Weick talks about sense making, and he sees it differently and defines it differently from the way the processes that we considered in the groupthink lecture when we spoke about decision making. So he talks about sense making as a way in which members use particular rules and engage in communication cycles. So let me just use his language. He talks about the assembly rules, which are the recipes, so the guide within the organisation for the way members actually talk about the situation, and talk not just about the situation but actually create the situation through their talk. So the rules themselves are they could be defined by a communications person. You could come in and examine the ways in which people are actually communicating. You'd obviously need a high degree of sensitivity to what's going on, so you'd need to be there for a while to understand the ways they're talking and what they're actually doing. The idea that they're engaging in cycles is to say that what they actually talk about, the information, some of it gets retained and some of it gets dropped. And what Weick spoke about is the fact that these cycles are actually part of a causal map. So let's just relate it to new staff. And a staff member joins, the business doesn't increase. In the right information environment, and we're talking about the information environment because we're talking about communication, you'd want people to share ideas, maybe think of ways to, you know, advertise or rebrand, get on social media, that kind of thing. Maybe they actually change part of the business to become a school in some way, to train others in new skills in order to reduce equivocality, because equivocality happens at times of crisis. So the kinds of communication you get in a crisis moment is going to be different from when things are working well. And the ways in which communication is viewed differently and works differently, because we need to make sure that we're not just talking about representation but talking about process, is to say that we have this idea of assembly rules, the cycles themselves to create and use new ideas, and these things being retained in causal maps. And we're going to look finally at something that Weick said in order to consider why this is such an important perspective. So let's end this lecture here today with a definition for organising as Karl Weick presented it. He talks about it as the resolving of equivocality in an enacted environment by means of interlocked behaviour embedded in conditionally related processes. So we've already come across resolving of equivocality, and as I said, in the hairdressing environment, in times of crisis there's a lot of equivocality, and the idea is to reduce it. So this idea of reducing the uncertainness, if you like, uncertainty. In an enacted environment simply means the environment is made by action through people. Interlocked behaviour is this idea of networks and how everything connects in different ways, and we've discussed our properties of networks. Embedded in conditionally related processes, this simply says that any process that happens has an action on another, and so all of these processes are connected, they're conditionally related, they depend on each other, and they change each other. So what Czarny-Orska said was the result of organising is interlocked cycles which can be represented as causal loops rather than a linear chain of cause and effects. So what we're trying to do in looking at systems theory as applied to organisation is in part get away from this process idea, and so we use enactment, selection and retention, which is rather language from biology, and it applies to organisation, can be applied to organisation. When we actually talk about people within an organisation, what we're really looking at is certain segments of the environment that essentially bracket individuals for active treatment, and this is a stage of innovation, if you like, and it corresponds in the biological sense to variation. Let's just come back to this idea of the butterfly, this image of the butterfly, and say that when we're considering interlocked behaviours, we can think about the flower. So if we were planting this flower in a garden, there's no guarantee that the flower will survive, there's no guarantee that it will attract a butterfly. But the concept of interlocked behaviours reveals that actually there are multiple possibilities of outcome. And those, of course, are more than just the idea that the flower will grow and that the flower may attract a butterfly. And that can be used to explain how organisations, for example, become divergent over time, and how they spread and how they increase. So you can have an environment in which a particular function is dealt with, a particular function is enacted by that organisation, and the way in which it expands, one way, might be for specialists within that organisation find a need to branch off. So there's a different kind of expertise that happens within that organisation, and it becomes a new organisation, unless the organisation can find ways to retain them. So there's a lot that can be learned from using general systems theory and applying it to this process of organising. I think this has given us a whole new way of considering organisation. I'm going to suggest two things. One, that you take a look at the Czarny-Orska paper, which I'm going to post as a resource, because I think it's exceptional in explaining Karl Weick's work. And it's, you know, once you take on board this language and once you've understood this lecture, I think it's relatively easygoing. I'm also going to suggest that you refer to the text for this course, the Catherine Miller text, and look at the cultural metaphor as applied to organisation, It gives us a number of other ways, an anthropological view of looking at organisation, which I think will help you potentially with a particular query if you want to do it on this particular theoretical orientation. And finally, here are our citations. The Catherine Miller text is available to you, not the 7th edition, that's one I've been using, but the 6th edition is available as a soft copy. And then I'm saying the Zaniorska paper is really important, and I'm going to put that as a resource. And with that, I thank you.